different plans in the upcoming session, and one part was directed specifically to Indigenous peoples.
The government will be a reliable partner to Indigenous peoples, upholding its fundamental commitment to advancing reconciliation. Central to this commitment is the creation of long-term wealth and prosperity with Indigenous people.
The Mandelson Affair, royal humiliation before Trump's arrival. Good evening, and welcome back to UK Connors, where we dissect the machinations of British politics without the usual Westminster whitewash. If you're new here, do hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you'll want to stay informed about what's really happening behind the palace gates and Downing Street's closed doors. Picture this. King Charles III, preparing for what should be a straightforward diplomatic engagement with the incoming American administration, instead finds himself privately seething about a scandal that threatens to overshadow the entire affair. Day before Donald Trump's scheduled arrival on British soil, September 16 to be precise, with Melania arriving a day earlier, the monarchy finds itself embroiled in what palace insiders are calling an absolute nightmare scenario. The Lord Mandelson affair has become the diplomatic equivalent of stepping on a landmine while wearing your best shoes. Charles, according to sources close to the palace, has been heard lamenting this debacle as an unwelcome distraction that threatens to derail what was meant to be a carefully choreographed state visit. One diplomatic source put it rather bluntly on Tuesday. The palace has been grumbling about how unhelpful it all is. That's diplomatic speak for absolute fury, by the way. But let's rewind and examine how we arrived at this spectacular mess, shall we? Lord Peter Mandelson, the consummate political operator who survived more scandals than a cat has lives, was handpicked by Prime Minister Keir Starmer to serve as Britain's ambassador to Washington. This wasn't just any appointment. This was a crown jewel of diplomatic postings, especially crucial in a post-Brexit landscape where Britain desperately needs to maintain its special relationship with America. Mandelson, with his decades of experience and his uncanny ability to navigate complex political waters, seemed like the perfect choice. He'd already begun preliminary discussions with Trump's team earlier this year, positioning himself as a key architect of what promised to be a historic trade agreement. Then came the Jeffrey Epstein connection, and everything went spectacularly wrong. Now, before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors. We're the only channel brave enough to tell you exactly how deep this rabbit hole goes. And trust me, it goes very deep indeed. The revelation that Lord Mandelson had ties to convicted pedophile Jeffrey Epstein wasn't entirely new. These connections had been documented before. What was new, however, was the extent of these relationships and, more crucially, Mandelson's apparent lack of transparency about them during his vetting process for the ambassadorial role. When confronted by Downing Street officials about his connections to Epstein, sources reveal that Mandelson was, shall we say, economical with the truth. That's a particularly damning phrase in Westminster circles. It's a polite way of saying someone has been deliberately misleading. The Prime Minister himself questioned Lord Mandelson directly about his relationship with Epstein as preparations for Trump's visit entered their final stages. What emerged from these conversations painted a picture that was far more concerning than initially understood. The relationship between Mandelson and Epstein had what Downing Street described as a materially different depth and extent than what had been revealed during the screening process. That's bureaucratic language for, he lied, and we found out. The final straw came with the release of U.S. congressional documents that contained previously unrevealed emails and photographs showing Lord Mandelson with Epstein. Among these documents was a particularly damaging piece of evidence, a letter in which Lord Mandelson wished Epstein a happy 50th birthday and referred to him as my best pal. The letter, sent in December of last year, was the kind of smoking gun that makes political careers evaporate overnight. By Thursday, Downing Street had had enough. The decision to dismiss Lord Mandelson was announced with a kind of speed that suggests panic in the corridors of power. For his part, Mandelson has stated that he regrets his friendship with Epstein and warned that additional very embarrassing details of his relationship with a pedophile financier would likely emerge. That's the kind of statement that keeps spin doctors awake at night. When a politician warns that worse revelations are coming, you can be certain they're coming. But here's where this story becomes not just politically damaging, but genuinely dangerous for Britain's international standing. The dismissal of Lord Mandelson has left the United Kingdom without an ambassador to Washington at perhaps the most critical diplomatic moment in recent memory. Trump's administration is preparing to take office with an agenda that could fundamentally reshape the transatlantic relationship. Trade deals, security arrangements, climate policies, all of these crucial areas require skilled diplomatic navigation. Instead, Britain finds itself rudderless in Washington, scrambling to find a replacement who can build the kind of relationships that take years to develop, and they need to do it in weeks. The timing couldn't be worse. Trump's state visit was meant to be a celebration of the enduring special relationship between Britain and America. Instead, it's become a damage limitation exercise. The palace has already been forced to scale back the public elements of the visit. Gone is a traditional carriage procession through central London with its thousands of cheering crowds. Instead, Trump will be confined to the exclusive Windsor estate, with any carriage procession limited to the private home park. He won't be visiting Westminster Abbey to pay respect to the grave of the unknown warrior, a traditional element of state visits that carries deep symbolic significance. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We're just getting to the really scandalous part, and you won't want to miss what comes next. These changes aren't just about security concerns or scheduling conflicts. They represent a fundamental acknowledgement that this visit is now politically toxic. The palace, which prides itself on being above the political fray, finds itself directly implicated in a scandal that touches on some of the most sensitive issues in modern politics. The specter of Jeffrey Epstein doesn't just haunt Lord Mandelson. It also brings unwanted attention to Prince Andrew, whose own connections to the convicted pedophile have been a source of ongoing embarrassment for the royal family. This is where the story becomes truly damaging for King Charles personally. The monarch has spent his reign trying to modernize the institution while maintaining its dignity and relevance. The Epstein connections represent everything he's tried to distance the monarchy from: privilege without accountability, connections that compromise integrity, and the kind of scandal that undermines public trust. When palace sources speak of Charles lamenting this as distraction, they're not just talking about diplomatic inconvenience. They are talking about a fundamental threat to the carefully constructed image of a reformed, responsible monarchy. The diplomatic ramifications extend far beyond the immediate embarrassment. Britain's post-Brexit strategy has been built around the concept of global Britain, the idea that the UK could compensate for leaving the European Union by strengthening relationships with partners around the world. The United States sits at the heart of this strategy. American investment, American trade, American security cooperation, all of these are crucial to Britain's future prosperity and security. The Mandelson affair has potentially compromised all of these relationships at their most vulnerable moment. Consider the optic from Washington's perspective. The British government appointed someone with substantial connections to Jeffrey Epstein as their chief representative to America, then had to fire him when the full extent of these connections emerged. This doesn't just look incompetent, it looks reckless. It suggests either a failure of due diligence so profound as to be inexcusable, or a willingness to overlook serious character issues for political convenience. Neither interpretation reflects well on British judgment or values. The political damage to Keir Starmer personally is similarly severe. The Prime Minister, who has built his political brand around integrity and competence, now faces questions about his own judgment. How was Lord Mandelson appointed without a full understanding of his Epstein connections? Why weren't these relationships properly investigated during the vetting process? And perhaps most damagingly, what does this say about Labour's commitment to the kind of ethical standards they promised during the election campaign? Make sure you're subscribed to UK Connors. We're the only channel that will follow this story wherever it leads, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the establishment. The Labour Party's response has been telling in its defensiveness. Rather than accepting full responsibility for the vetting failure, party sources have briefed that Lord Mandelson misled them about the extent of his Epstein connections. This might be true, but it raises even more uncomfortable questions. If Lord Mandelson was indeed economical with the truth, why wasn't this discovered during what should have been an exhaustive background check? The role of ambassador to Washington is one of the most sensitive positions in British diplomacy. The vetting process should be rigorous enough to uncover any potential compromising relationships. The international implications are equally serious. Britain's reputation for diplomatic competence, built over centuries, takes a significant hit when high-profile appointments have to be reversed due to scandal. Other nations, particularly those considering post-Brexit trade relationships with the UK, will be watching carefully to see how Britain handles this crisis. Do they have confidence in British institutions? Can they trust British assurances about due diligence and proper procedures? The European Union, in particular, will be observing with considerable interest. The Brexit negotiations were characterized by British claims of superior governance and more rigorous standards than their continental counterparts. The Mandelson affair suggests that these claims were, at best, premature. EU leaders who were forced to endure years of British lectures about sovereignty and proper governance will not be slow to point out the irony. From a broader perspective, this scandal illuminates some uncomfortable truths about the British establishment. The same networks that have dominated British politics for decades, the web of connections between politics, media, finance, and society, are the same networks that enabled Jeffrey Epstein's access to power and influence. Lord Mandelson's connections to Epstein weren't formed in isolation. They were part of a broader ecosystem of elite relationships that prioritized access and influence over scrutiny and accountability. The Jeffrey Epstein case exposed similar networks in the United States, leading to soul-searching about how such a figure could operate with impunity for so long. Britain now faces its own reckoning. How many other figures in positions of power and influence had relationships with Epstein? How many of these relationships have been properly scrutinized? And crucially, what does this say about the systems of accountability that are supposed to protect democratic institutions? Subscribe to UK Connors now if you want to stay ahead of these revelations, because trust me, there are more coming. The palace's handling of this crisis will be particularly crucial for King Charles's long-term reputation. The monarch's response to scandal has traditionally been to maintain dignified silence while allowing the political system to manage the consequences. But this scandal directly touches a royal family through the Prince Andrew connection, and it threatens to overshadow a state visit that should have been a moment of diplomatic triumph. Charles faces a delicate balancing act. Too much public comment risks dragging the monarchy further into political controversy. Too little risks appearing disconnected from legitimate public concern about the standards expected of those in positions of power. The reported grumbling from palace sources suggests a monarch who is deeply frustrated by a situation largely beyond his control, but which nonetheless reflects on his judgment and that of his government. The timing of Trump's visit adds another layer of complexity to this crisis. The incoming American president has his own complicated relationship with scandal and controversy. The juxtaposition of Trump's arrival amid the Mandelson affair creates a perfect storm of reputational risk for both nations. American media coverage of the visit will inevitably focus on the scandal, potentially overshadowing any substantive diplomatic achievements. This is particularly damaging because the visit was meant to demonstrate the strength and continuity of the special relationship regardless of who occupies the White House or Downing Street. Instead, it now appears to demonstrate the fragility of that relationship and the ease with which it can be derailed by individual scandals and poor judgment. The search for a replacement ambassador adds urgency to an already fraught situation. Whoever takes on the role will inherit a poisoned chalice. They must rebuild relationships that have been damaged by this scandal while also establishing their own credibility with a new American administration. The usual diplomatic niceties and gradual relationship-building processes will be luxuries they cannot afford. The broader question of accountability remains largely unanswered. Who will take responsibility for this diplomatic disaster? The Prime Minister has dismissed Lord Mandelson, but questions remain about the systems and processes that allowed this situation to develop. Will there be a comprehensive review of diplomatic appointment procedures? Will those responsible for the flawed vetting process face consequences? Or will this be treated as an unfortunate but isolated incident that requires no systematic response? The British public, meanwhile, watches this unfold with a mixture of embarrassment and resignation that has become all too familiar. Another scandal, another resignation, another promise to do better next time. The cumulative effect of these repeated failures is to erode public trust in the basic competence of British institutions. When the country's most senior diplomatic appointment can be derailed by connections that should have been discovered during routine vetting, what confidence can citizens have in less visible but equally important decisions? Hit subscribe to UK Connors. We're committed to holding these institutions accountable when they clearly won't hold themselves accountable. The international media coverage has been particularly brutal, and rightly so. Britain's claim to be a serious, responsible international partner is fundamentally undermined when such basic failures occur at the highest levels. The diplomatic community in Washington, London, and capitals around the world will be drawing their own conclusions about British competence and reliability. These impressions, once formed, can take years or even decades to reverse. The Epstein connection also raises uncomfortable questions about the broader culture of elite networking that characterizes British politics and society. The same dinner parties, social clubs, and informal networks that facilitate legitimate relationship building also provide cover for more problematic connections. The challenge for any reform-minded government is to distinguish between necessary relationship building and potentially compromising associations. Lord Mandelson's warning that more very embarrassing details may emerge suggests that this story is far from over. Each new revelation will provide fresh ammunition for political opponents and further opportunities for international embarrassment. The drip feed of scandal is often more damaging than a single catastrophic disclosure because it maintains the story in the headlines and prevents the normal process of political recovery. The palace's response to ongoing revelations will be crucial. King Charles cannot afford to appear associated with a widening scandal, but neither can he appear to be abandoning those who serve the crown when they face difficulty. The balance between loyalty and accountability is one that monarchs have struggled with for centuries, and Charles faces this challenge in an era of unprecedented media scrutiny and public cynicism about elite privilege. The implications for Trump's visit continue to evolve as the scandal unfolds. What was planned as a celebration of diplomatic friendship now risks becoming a damage limitation exercise focused on preventing further embarrassment. The reduced public elements of the visit reflect not just security concerns, but also political calculation. The fewer opportunities for protest or negative imagery, the better for both sides. This scandal also highlights the continued relevance of the Jeffrey Epstein case in international politics. Years after his death, Epstein's network of connections continues to generate political earthquakes around the world. Each new revelation serves as a reminder of how power and privilege can be abused, and how elite networks can provide cover for criminal behavior. The British political establishment's failure to properly address these connections reflects broader institutional weaknesses that extend well beyond individual cases. Don't forget to subscribe to UK Connors. We're the only channel brave enough to connect these dots and show you the bigger picture that the mainstream media won't touch. As this crisis continues to unfold, the fundamental questions about British governance and diplomatic competence remain largely unanswered. The Mandelson affair is not just about one individual's poor judgment or even one government's vetting failures. It's about systemic weaknesses in how Britain selects, scrutinizes, and holds accountable those who represent the nation on the world stage. Until these systemic issues are addressed, similar scandals are not just possible but probable. The damage to Britain's international reputation may prove to be the most lasting consequence of this affair. Diplomatic relationships, once damaged, can take generations to fully repair. The special relationship with America, in particular, depends on mutual trust and confidence in each other's judgment and reliability. The Mandelson scandal has shaken both, at precisely the moment when Britain most needs American partnership and support. King Charles finds himself presiding over a monarchy that promised renewal and modernization, but instead finds itself embroiled in the same kinds of scandal that plagued previous generations. The challenge to the king is to demonstrate that the institution can learn from these failures and implement meaningful reforms, rather than simply weathering the storm and hoping public attention moves elsewhere. The coming days and weeks will be crucial in determining how much lasting damage this scandal inflicts on British interests and institutions. The handling of Trump's visit will provide an early indicator of whether Britain can move past this embarrassment and restore some degree of diplomatic credibility, or whether the Mandelson affair will be remembered as a turning point in the decline of British international influence. What's certain is that this story represents more than just another political scandal. It's a test of whether British institutions are capable of the kind of accountability and reform that democratic governance requires, or whether they will continue to rely on the same networks and assumptions that enabled this crisis in the first place. This is exactly the kind of analysis you'll only get here on UK Connors, where we're committed to telling you the truth about British politics, no matter how uncomfortable it makes the establishment. Subscribe now. Because if the scandal has taught us anything, it's that there are always more revelations waiting to emerge, and you'll want to be ready when they do. We're just getting started, and the story of how Britain's elite networks enabled and covered up uncomfortable truths is far from over. Stay informed, Stay critical, and we'll see you in the next video where we'll continue to hold power to account.